Hello, and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and the ways in which they advance human flourishing. I'm Angelica Worth.
And I'm Thomas Walker, and I want to pick up on a story that really gets to the ideas that make them possible part of that, which I don't think we've covered as much as the other parts so much. This is the story that 10 members of the Afghan Robotics team, which is a team of young girls between 12 and 18, or young women between 12 and 18, in Afghanistan who work on robotics projects. And this was founded by a woman called Roya Mahbub, living in a remote part of Afghanistan. And in her parents' basement, these girls got together and started building robotics projects using scrap metal and whatever they could find lying around. Basically, incredibly resourceful, curious people in a country where and a culture where women taking an interest in that kind of thing is frowned upon, to say the least, and also one where resources are not plentiful. So, impressive resourcefulness and innovativeness from these people. In 2017, they traveled twice to Kabul, crossing Taliban-controlled territories to do so, in order to apply for US visas to attend the Washington First Global Challenge, it's a robotics competition in DC. And they were refused both times, and no good reason was given. So that caused a bit of a public outcry and a campaign, and ultimately some people managed to convince the US State Department to overturn the decision and grant them those visas. So they traveled to Washington for the competition, but unfortunately their robotics gear, the customs people were like, "What the hell is this? You're coming from Afghanistan. You've got pieces of equipment. You can see what it might have looked like." So that got confiscated off them. So they had to start from scratch after arriving. So with 2 weeks to go, they built their
Everyone
robots.
else had months, didn't they?
Yeah, everyone else had months to, and they're building robots for a competition. So they built theirs in 2 weeks from scratch, and scooped the silver medal with it, which is just incredibly impressive. And after doing that, they traveled on to
perseverance on their end.
Yeah, and then they traveled on to Europe and competed in the International Robotics competition in Estonia and won the Entrepreneur Challenge award there as well. Competed in Istanbul as well, and then traveled back to Afghanistan. Unfortunately, after they got back to Afghanistan, the team captain's father was killed in a suicide attack. So it just gives an indication of how dangerous an environment they were living in back home. So they were keen to get out of that again. And they spent a lot of 2018 and 2019 in Canada, and traveled into the US again there on that trip. So doing more research, getting more access to resources. But then they're back in Afghanistan when the COVID-19 situation came along. And as that was happening, the Afghan government was looking for people who can supply cheaper, more portable ventilators for COVID-19 patients. Obviously, Afghanistan has poor resources. A lot of people are away from hospital facilities, or getting things to people is difficult, especially $50,000 ventilators, not easy to come by. The robotics team was one of 6 groups who responded to that request from the Afghan government, and they came up with a design for a cheap $500 portable battery-powered ventilator.
Well, in situation in Afghanistan notwithstanding, having medical equipment be cheaper just makes it more accessible to people across the board.
Yeah, obviously, poverty is rife, but it's just difficult to get anything anywhere, particularly with conflict going on in some of those regions. So they built this to an MIT blueprint, but used parts from a Toyota Corolla to assemble it. And their design actually got approved by the Afghan Ministry of Health. So they that actually got approved to be put into production and used. So that was the situation prior to the recent Taliban takeover following the US and allied withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obviously, that seems to have happened quicker than some people expected it to, although others might say that was somewhat predictable. But the charity that worked with them originally to help them come over to the West and to help them get set up was the Digital Citizens Fund, DCF, New York-based 513c. Who specifically focus on helping women in parts of the world where women don't really have opportunities, where gender inequality is extreme. Predominantly the Middle East for obvious cultural reasons. Just women aren't allowed to choose their own career in some of these places. So they work with women in those areas, trying to get them the kind of access to opportunities that they take for granted elsewhere in the world. And so when the Taliban started taking over again, obviously the Taliban with their hardline Islamism, basically don't give women rights at all. No, you can give someone
And
rights,
they
but
also
they don't respect the rights of women at all.
they also deny the rights of others as well, not just women.
Yeah, they deny the rights of pretty much everyone. But I mean, I think the worst thing to be in a hardline, Taliban state is a woman, or particularly a woman with an interest in science who wants to build a career and innovate. So the DCF was keen to try and get them out of there, and they worked with the Qatar Minister of Foreign Affairs. Qatar is where a lot of the evacuees from Afghanistan have ended up going through, to try and get them out into Qatar. And they managed to get 10 out, or I should say 10 managed to get out. I'll come on to that in a minute. Some are still there, but a number of them are successfully out now, and 5 of those have since gone on to Mexico. So the ones who got out have all been offered scholarships to go to different places, some in the US, some in Europe and elsewhere. But 5 of them took up an offer from Mexico. And one of them, Fatima Kadaran, I think I'm saying her name right, after arriving in Mexico said, "We are happy to be here. From now on, we will have the opportunities for many more achievements in our lives." The kinds of opportunities they just didn't have back in Afghanistan. So, from an American or even a British point of view, Mexico may not seem like the safest, easiest place to live, but it's a phenomenal upgrade from what they were used to. It's a place where they can choose what they do with their lives, where they can have access to resources, and it must be a phenomenal change for them. The limitations they were operating under gave them clearly a certain, or their response to that gave them a resourcefulness and an ability to think outside the box. And I hope that they're able to take advantage of the resources they'll have access to now.
I imagine they will.
Yeah, I'm almost a little concerned in a sense, because I think sometimes educational institutions limit people's creativity and curiosity, and these people have just overcome horrific circumstances really by developing more creativity and curiosity. So I hope that they're able to continue growing that where they are now, and I'm pretty sure they will. I think that's part of who they are now. I also want to read out a little quote from DCF board member Elizabeth Shayfair Brown, who told NBC News that ultimately the girls rescued themselves. If it were not for their hard work and courage to pursue an education which brought them in contact with the world, they would still be trapped. We need to continue to support them and others like them. So, it was their efforts to try and get access to education, which is to say women just won't have now in a Taliban regime, that brought them in contact with the people who then were able to help rescue them. I think that's a moral we can take away for all of our lives, really, is the more you put yourself out there and make connections with people, the more opportunities you'll have. But trying to do that in an environment where being seen to be a woman trying to get into science potentially marks you for death is just incredible bravery, and driving across Taliban-controlled regions. It reminds you of Malala in Pakistan. Was it 2012 that happened? Where and the work she's done since. Just the bravery in defending everybody's right to choose their own path in life is really impressive.
And it's nice to see people recognizing them and helping them too. The DCF helping them get out, and the universities offering them scholarships. And the bravery and intelligence and perseverance that these girls have shown is impressive enough in its own right, and the accomplishments they've already managed at such a young age without even going to college is all impressive, and that is impressive, and we definitely want to celebrate it. But we also want to celebrate the people that are helping them and helping them get to a better place.
Yeah, I just want to finish up by saying that for innovation to happen, like cheap ventilators and robot designs, you need a society that's free enough for everybody to be able to choose what they want to do. If you deny women the right to do that, then you cut off 50% of your potential innovation, and resourcefulness. That's not just innovation in the sort of sense we talk about. That's every productive endeavor that anyone can get into, art and science, politics, just everything that somebody can do constructively. You're just limiting half of your potential. And so that's just moronic. Aside from the the denial of rights of those people to live happy, fulfilling lives, which these 10 will now have, but so many people who are still in Afghanistan won't. And so it's a two-sided thing. It's part, the most important part is that human beings need to be able to flourish. They need freedom to be able to live their lives. And even if these 10 don't produce any other technologies that help people or help society, the fact that they're able to live their lives is worth it by itself. But clearly the kind of people they are, they will do amazing things with their lives, whatever line of work they end up going into. And I'm quite excited to see. I'm pretty sure we'll see some more interesting innovations coming out of them in the coming years. But fundamentally, for the kind of things that we talk about on the show to happen, you have to have a free society. And that's why the vast majority of what we talk about comes out of the US, Western Europe, and countries like that. And it's very nice to be able to cover a story that came out of somewhere like Afghanistan, but it's just not possible in the kind of society that they have there unless you have just this degree of bravery and resourcefulness.
And unfortunately, more so now that the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan again.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, really.
Yes. But out of the tragedy, we can appreciate certain bright spots, such as this young team of robotics creators. I couldn't think of the word for it. Sorry. But I'm going to move on now, and we're going to talk about a step forward in a problem that humans have been trying to solve really for centuries and have made enormous leaps forward but haven't fully solved, which is that of infant mortality. And the specific advancement has to do with testing sugars from breast milk to treat bacterial infections. So the bacterial infections that we're talking about here are from group B Streptococcus bacteria, which we call GBS for short, because Streptococcus is a mouthful. And these bacteria infect fetuses and newborns, and I think they actually infect the mother first in her reproductive tract, and then gets passed to the newborn that way. And it can cause all manner of blood infections. It can cause meningitis, which can, in serious instances, cause a baby partial or total hearing loss.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that sort of before the advent of medical technology, infant mortality was crazy. Like, you'll often hear people say things like, people only lived to 28 when we were a pre-technological civilization. But what was actually the case is people lived to their 60s and 70s, but then so many people died in childhood that it skews the average right now. But it was, even until a couple centuries ago, it was, if you had 10 kids and you might expect 2 or 3 to survive.
Yeah. And as I said, we've made great strides in that, but GBS can still cause stillbirths to this day, which is, absolutely devastating for a couple who are hoping to have a baby. And then on top of it, a problem that some of us may be aware of is that these bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics, because the standard treatment we think of these days, we're lucky to have antibiotics, but a lot of bacteria have started developing resistance to them, including GBS. And to give you an idea of the scope of this problem today, it's estimated that about 2,000 babies die in the US from this. 2,000 babies get this bacteria infection in the US, and of those, 4 to 6% die from it.
4 to 6%.
4 to 6, not 46. 4 to 6. And to give you a reference, of all the people who get COVID in the US, about 2 to 3% die. Obviously, estimates aren't perfect with these numbers, but and fatality rate from COVID varies by country, but to give you an idea.
I think that's more of the confirmed cases, or the cases that go to hospital, because there's so many more COVID. Because I've heard a 0.5% mortality rate for COVID-19 when it's properly considered.
Right. Yeah, that's just off of confirmed cases, off the data that we have firmly. And on a worldwide scale, the World Health Organization estimates that GBS infections cause 150,000 stillbirths every year.
So just as a proportion of infections, this is more deadly than COVID-19.
Than COVID, yes. Yeah. That's why I was giving those numbers as a comparison. Yeah. That rate does vary a little bit by country, but in the US, yes.
I imagine it's higher in countries with poorer infrastructure, probably.
Yeah, I don't have the
Yeah.
rates for GBS for other countries, but in COVID it is.
Yeah.
Um, Again, it does depend, like you said, on having an accurate count of the actual cases, but of the confirmed cases, yeah. So this, but like I said, they've been doing some research on some possible treatments that circumvent the antibiotic resistance issue. And who they are specifically is a group working at Vanderbilt University. This research, their most recent research, I'll explain, it's been in two stages. But their most recent research was presented at the fall 2021 meeting of the American Chemical Society, a nonprofit organization that brings together scientists working on chemical issues. And it was presented by a graduate student named Rebecca Moore. And she is working under Dr. Stephen Townsend and Jennifer Gaddy. As I said, they're all at Vanderbilt University, which is a private university that is named after Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a rail and shipping magnate who gave the school its seed money. And you're smiling because you like Vanderbilt.
Yeah, it's created the New York Central Railroad. I'm a rail geek, so yeah, it's particularly interesting to me.
But onto the actual innovation that they presented. So they've been studying human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs for short, because that's also a mouthful. And HMOs are short strings of sugar molecules that you find abundantly in breast milk. And so they had found previously in a paper that they published in 2017 that in a like petri dish type situation, I don't know if it was actually in a petri dish, but in a outside of the human body situation, these HMOs seem to be killing off the GBS. And so they started to dig into that more. And in this new round of research, they've tested it in mice. They've tested it in certain tissues in humans. Specifically the immune cells and placentas and the gestational membranes, which are the sacs that grow around the fetus. And in all of these cases, it has either completely knocked out the GBS or significantly reduced it to the point where it wouldn't cause an infection. That would be a problem. Which leads us to wonder, why is this happening?
Yeah, how does that work? Yeah.
Exactly. You wouldn't think, or at least I wouldn't think, that sugars would be able to bring down bacteria, because typically sugars act as food for bacteria.
And for us.
And for us, yes. And so it seems to work in two ways, which one, it works by preventing the pathogens from adhering to the tissues in the first place. And two, it seems to basically feed the good bacteria. So some of you guys might know that every living organism, well, every large organism has a microbiome in them, which is basically just an organism, like an ecosystem inside your body of tiny like bacteria. And a lot of them are what we call good bacteria because they perform some function that helps you. And normally in a healthy person, there's this balance going on of the good bacteria and bacteria from other sources that could be bad, such as this GBS. This is why antibiotics can also be a problem. This is why people take probiotics. So people take probiotics to help encourage that good bacteria, for example, in your digestive system. When you take antibiotics, they do their job, they kill everything. And so this can lead to an experience that I've personally had where I took antibiotics for an infection and it solved that infection. It was an infected bug bite that cleared up, but I ended up having another infection as a result of it because the antibiotics knocked out all the good bacteria that have been keeping my system in check.
Yeah.
So another reason to be seeking out an alternative such as these HMOs, which they seem to be helping the good bacteria outcompete the bad bacteria. And so they tested this again in a petri dish situation where without interference, they put the good bacteria and the GBS together, and the GBS were releasing lactic acid that was weakening the good bacteria, and the GBS were taking over basically. Right. But when they added these HMOs, then what was happening is the good bacteria was feeding on the HMOs, and they were able to withstand the lactic acid from the GBS. And so it's sort of similar to, if any of you garden, the same concept as fertilizing your flowers so that the weeds don't take over.
Yeah.
So they're still working on this. They've obviously, this has really promising future applications. specifically for preventing and treating infections in fetuses and babies. One thing that they're specifically still working on is trying to isolate which of the HMOs is actually having this effect, because there are over 200 that are unique to humans. And some of them have not had this effect when they're isolated by themselves. So it's only some of them that are having this effect. And by isolating it, we can be able to replicate it in a lab, so that women who can't or don't want to breastfeed we can still treat babies with that. Also, when the babies are still in the mother and don't have access to breast milk. And also, there's some potential to even use this as an antibiotic replacement in adults for treating bacterial infections. But we have to know specifically what it is. So that's one of the things they're working on now. So.
Very interesting.
Yes.
So if we will move along to our honorable mentions, I want to start with another robotics topic. Well, not actually, my main was sort of robotics connected, although that really was about the ideas more than robots. But I did have 2 robotics topics last week. This one's a bit stranger. Elon Musk, everybody's favorite clown / businessman, unveiled his plans for the Tesla bot, which is a sort of domestic robot using the AI developed for Tesla's autonomous cars. And I'll talk about AI a little in a moment, but he didn't actually unveil a robot. He unveiled a man dressed as a robot who did some strange dances and movements. And he kind of promised us the real thing next year. So it's a typical Elon Musk press release situation of what's he going for here. But the interesting thing is he's trying to create what to my mind is somewhere between iRobot and C-3PO, a kind of domestic servitor who does your shopping, takes out the trash, maybe cleans up around the house. But this isn't like a military robot or anything. He's deliberately designed it to be weak and slow, so that in the event of the robot takeover, iRobot style robot takeover that he seems to envisage, it won't be able to resist you. I think you had something that this reminded
I was just going to say
this.
This whole concept reminds me of in the steampunk novel I'm reading in the first series, the Finishing School series by Gail Carriger. They have a robot that's sort of similar. They call them mechanicals, and they basically do the same thing. They're roughly human size. They'll bring you tea and clean your house, and they actually don't go get your shopping because they can't leave your house in this scenario. But the point is, the idea has been around in fiction in a number of ways for a while. So it's kind of cool to see somebody actually planning to bring something like that out in the next year or two.
Yeah, and this has the kind of cool, sleek look of the 2004 iRobot movie robots, but the dexterity of C-3PO, waddling along and not really being able to do very much. And the thing is, Elon Musk has a worry that AI is going to take over the world, and AI is just not there at all. And it's still something that it has a limited ability to learn from its environment and develop, but it's still something that only does what it's programmed. It can't have an original thoughts. It can't develop morals or something like that. It's still a tool that's going to be used how it's going to be used. So I don't think that's a serious concern at this point. I think the possibility of them being hacked and used by bad people is certainly something to consider. But I think his reasons for making them slow and weak is a little bit questionable. I can just see them getting pushed over by people when they're on their way to the shops and things like that. But I don't think making them a little stronger might not be the worst thing. But he's very much designing these for domestic applications. And a little word on Musk himself, he benefits inordinately from government favors, because particularly through Tesla, which just wouldn't be a viable business if it wasn't for the amount of subsidies and grants and infrastructure it receives. And he's kind of gained a massive chunk of the car market against competitors who don't have that advantage. And likewise in SpaceX, a lot of that's riding on the back of government contracts. At the same time, I have a lot of respect for him as someone who has a vision of a world he wants to live in and just goes about creating it. and he developed PayPal originally, but then used the proceeds from that, as any kind of good entrepreneur does, to favor his values. And he wants to live in a world that has electric cars, accessible space flight, and fancy robots, and he's just doing all of that. He's definitely someone without whom we wouldn't live in as cool a world as we do. And it's not just about being cool and exciting. I think access to space is really important for our future. Improving efficiency of vehicles and things like that is a very good thing to do.
And on this particular innovation, this Tesla bot, not having to spend so much time on the drudgery of household chores.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a debate about labor-saving devices, and to what extent, it depends how you use them. Like, again, any tool. Like, if you just let a machine do everything and you just sit down and watch TV all day, then that's not a good thing to happen. It's better if you walk into the shops and stuff. But a proactive minded person would use that time to exercise in a different way, go somewhere interesting, read, create, learn.
I think kind of you're also, in our context, when I'm in England with you, we walk to the shops a lot, but most Americans drive to the grocery store.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, we just have a totally different urban geography here. And there's a lot of, driverless cars, which is where this AI came from, might change that if you don't have a 4x4 sitting on your drive and you just, get an app to bring you your car when you need to go somewhere. Maybe American cities might move a bit more towards that kind of walkable, more healthy for the human body, way of being than they currently are. But yeah, certainly in this country, we walking to the shops is sort of part of daily life. But no, it's an old debate, and I think labor-saving devices generally are a good thing. It's just like any technology, you need to have the right attitude to how you use it. And I am someone who tries to maintain my ability to do mental arithmetic and to use a paper map to find something and things like that. And I'll use the technology when it's useful to me, but I'll also try and keep my own faculties sharp for when I need them as well, because it's just some technology might not always be there. But I think by and large, this is a very good thing to have if it goes to plan. Obviously his timetables slip a lot, but so do everybody's. And when you're creating cutting edge technologies, I think it's a given that the fact it's happening at all is something to be grateful for. And if it doesn't hit the expected release date, that's just means it's being done properly.
Right. Okay, so moving on from that, I've got another well, I've mentioned before on this show how much I love biotechnology and that sort of integration of two different fields. And this is an even bigger integration of even more fields, and it's really cool. So there are a group of researchers who are, just to broadly state it, they are using the way that elephant trunks move to inspire better robotics. And I'll dig into that, but that's basically what it is. So
we will not have this much robotics in our episodes normally.
Robotics are cool, and they definitely improve human life. So one of the researchers, one of the several people involved in this project, Mikhail Milinkovic, who is a professor of physics of biology at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. So his job already is the physics of biology.
Yeah, professor of physics of biology. So that's the physics of how biology works.
Yes, of how animals move, right. And how things work like that. So he explains the problem thus. Classical robots are extremely good for performing a specific task for which they've been designed. If you want that robot to do something a little different, it will fail miserably. Which has certainly been the case historically. I think some are starting to get a bit better, but they're still usually pretty limited in what they can do. They can only be programmed to do, probably a couple of things at this point, but so many things.
Or just physically limited by the, not so much
by their design,
but yeah.
Yeah. And you were talking about, Boston Dynamics making some significant improvements in that area, but this is another way of going about it. And so in contrast, Milinkovic is looking at elephant trunks, which are really versatile. They can pick up a single blade of grass, or they can pick up something that weighs 600 pounds with the same trunk. And they do this thing where they form pseudo joints. A trunk is sort of one long thing, but it can act for a while as though it has an elbow or a wrist.
So they sort of form a point of stiffness to,
So it's really quite cool. And so Milinkovic and his team have utilized technology from the movie industry. So there's another integration there, wherein this is the same technology that was used for Gollum in The Lord of the Rings and the Na'vis in the Avatar movie, where they put sensors on the trunks of, in this case, it was two African elephants. Normally it would be an actor. And then
this is motion capture you're talking about.
Motion capture, yes. And then using infrared cameras as to capture the movement as the animals are moving or the actors are moving. And then they can build this whole 3D model based off of what they've picked up. And so in this case, they use two African elephants picking up a variety of objects with these sensors attached to their trunks. So they've released a paper with all of their findings, which is now going to be used with their partners, because they're working with university in Italy. The team there is led by Lucia Bakai and another team in Israel. They're also working with a private 3D printing company called Photocentric. So two parts of this have really already been done. One part has yet to be done. So the first part is the studying in the models of the elephant trunks that Milinkovic and his team did. The other part that's been done is looking at, well, in all of these things that elephants are able to do, what exactly is it about their skin that facilitates this? And so material scientists have worked with this 3D printing company to create a new material that mimics those useful properties that can be 3D printed. So then the other researchers are going to try to use this technology to create robots that have more flexible and versatile arms. Yeah, like that. And that can be used, to do a variety of tasks in industries and factories, and helping lift older people, for example, or disabled people. They will probably be able to help with search and rescue efforts a lot better, just having more versatility there. And I think it was Bakai who mentioned that a lot of these technologies can also be commercialized. Like that material might be useful for other things, and they do plan to put it on the market at some point. So a lot of cool things going on with a lot of different people with different specializations working together. So
I just love the fact that we've gone from Elon Musk's, iRobot, race car driver looking design for a robot to, the bendy arms, which conjures up the image of the sort of lost in space, like, box with a dome on the roof with rubber tubes flapping around. If that's actually what robots end up looking like, that would be amazing.
I mean, think more of the grace of an elephant trunk.
I want as many flashing lights on this thing as possible.
I'm not putting you in charge of the robot design, dear. Sorry.
It will say Danger Will Robinson just randomly. But no. Okay.
Carrying on.
So I want to talk. So we're moving to the medical field now, and I want to talk about something that actually came up in something you talked about last week, because you were talking about prosthetics that are controlled by magnetic implants in people's limbs, and you mentioned in the course of that things that you're implanting into somebody's body need to be coated to prevent bacterial buildup on them. And Chalmers University, which is another private university, this one's in Sweden, has developed a new way of reducing that. So what happens sometimes when you embed a piece of technology in somebody's body, like that example, or like heart monitors and breathing stuff, just all the stuff that we put into our bodies for some reason or another, and it stays there for decades sometimes, and you get what's called a biofilm building up on the device sometimes. And that's because these devices are unusual textures to find in human body. They're metallic or plastic or whatever, and they're a different temperature and fluids and things. So they become an ideal environment for bacteria to build up on their surfaces and form these biofilms. And so they've been trying to find ways to discourage that, because that can lead to infections, obviously, as well as potentially impairing the function of this very small fine technology. So what they've done is they've used graphene covered with usnic acid, which is an acid that's extracted from lichens.
Lichens are cool too, because lichens aren't actually one organism. They're a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae.
So just to help anyone who made the same mistake I did and spent their entire life mispronouncing lichens as lichens, this is not lichens from Underworld. This is not werewolves. This is the, gooey, as you say, fungus and algae living together. I don't
You
know if
often
that's
see them
a
on trees.
yeah, I don't know if that's a UK US thing or if I've just been saying it wrong my whole life, but lichens is sounds right to me now. Specifically for fructose lichen, which this arsenic acid has come from. There was previous research that had indicated that arsenic acid has bactericidal properties, i.e., it kills bacteria. In this particular case, it prevents them from forming nucleic acids, so they can't synthesize RNA. So that means that they can't produce protein in their cells, so that they just die off because they can't grow. So it's not like throwing an anti what you were just talking about. The word's gone out of my head for a moment.
Antibiotic?
Yes, antibiotic into your system where it's going to go around and kill everything. It's just where the coating is that it prevents that buildup. So you don't have that risk that you were describing of wiping out all your good bacteria at the same time. So
Or of it becoming resistant.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So I think that's another great innovation that's come out of private research there, out of Sweden, which is another of those countries where innovation is a lot easier than it is in some places. Sweden has quite a lax regulatory environment for these kinds of things, and their corporate freedoms are quite impressive compared to most European countries. It's a very high tax country, but otherwise it's a very free country. It's another place where this kind of innovation happens quite a lot compared to many places. So I thought that was definitely something worth celebrating, because it will, when somebody's in a medical situation where they need implants in their bodies, then they really don't want to be getting bacterial infections on top of that.
Right. Probably already vulnerable in many cases. Okay, so today I'm going to wrap up with another cool topic, which is it has to do with sharks and drones. So basically, just as a broad overview, what it is that there's been some research involving drones that shows that sharks are closer to people than we realize, more often than we realize, and they don't care. They're not interested in people. They mostly just ignore them. So more specifically, this research is being done by a man named Chris Lowe, who's a marine biologist and the director of the Shark Lab at California State University, Long Beach. Again, what a job title, director of the Shark Lab.
What's that line from Austin Powers? I just want freaking sharks with freaking laser beams attached to their heads. Is that what he produces?
No. No, he studies shark behavior with a particular interest in great whites and their behavior around people. And so I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of having drones involved in this research. So before, if you wanted to get a bird's eye view of what sharks were doing, you'd have to get on a plane or helicopter. And Lowe used to do this, but it's very expensive. Versus the average drone is, a couple $100s, and the average middle class person can buy one. Many people do, in fact, own a drone. Yes, like that one. And granted, these probably have some nice cameras hooked up to them, so they might be a little bit more expensive than the average drone, but they're still way, way cheaper than getting on a plane, and you can get so much more footage that way. And in fact, Lowe has hundreds of hours of footage that he's combing through for this research, which is not completely concluded. The other cool thing about drones being involved is, again, the average citizen can buy one, which allows people to be, in this sense, citizen scientists, which is, if you're not familiar with the concept, it's basically just the idea of average people who, don't have degrees in science or anything, but are interested in some aspect of science, whether it's butterflies or sharks, or I think you can do it with something astronomy related too, can't you?
Yeah. NASA has a citizen science program. So if you have a telescope and things like, you can get involved in that.
Yeah. So whatever area of science you're interested in, and it's totally voluntary, but you can help collect data and help actual scientists. In a lot of cases, they will actually use your data. And that's the case for Lowe. If you have data, or not data, but footage from a drone of sharks, or especially sharks around people, he will take your footage and use it. He hastens to add, you should be a licensed drone pilot, but he has had people send in footage of sharks near people, and he has included it in his research. But why this is relevant to most people who are not interested in sharks is that sharks being around people on beaches when they are seen often leads to the beach being closed, which, besides just not being fun, can also have some negative effects for the economy, especially if it's closed for a long period of time, or if it closes frequently, because then people don't go to the beach. The businesses, on the beach or around the beach, don't make as much money, and we have this economic harm that really there hasn't been a strong scientific backing for, that there is actually that danger. And now Lowe's research is pointing to evidence against it, actually. Because as I was saying, over and over again, he's just seeing these sharks near people, and unless they're being chased, they don't care. They're not interested in people.
Yeah, I mean, I think people's perception of sharks comes from four Jaws movies and Deep Blue Sea, and what's the other one? The Meg.
I don't know.
It's just all these movies where sharks attack people. It is where people's conceptions of shark behavior come from. And it's like 8 people a year die from shark attacks.
Yeah, it's a very, very low number.
Tiny, yeah.
Yeah. Most sharks, unless you're chasing them or harassing them, I think the phrase he used is that they treat people like flotsam. They really don't care that you're around. So not having to close beaches when there are sharks around would be cool. But there's another effect that I wanted to talk about related to this that I think extends to technology more broadly, which is it's a little bit freaky to realize how often sharks are close to people when we didn't know that before. And I think it leads to this perception that technology in general, and having phones on our cameras, having cameras on our phones that we have with us all the time, we can just whip out and record or take pictures whenever, has led to this perception that we're in a much more dangerous world than we were in 40, 50 years ago. And there's, it does depend on where you live, and there are some things that are different than they were 40, 50 years ago, but overall crime in most countries hasn't increased. What's increased is your awareness of it because of technology.
Yeah, if anything, it's gone down a lot. I kind of have 2 examples of this really. Like one is I had a friend who shared a video of people turn up in a van and start breaking into a shop in London. He's like, London never used to be this dangerous when I was young in the 1970s. And it's like, no, it was more dangerous when you were
more dangerous in the 1970s.
It's just that everybody could whip out a smartphone. And you had the same thing with the BLM riots last year. And it's like people acting like that's a completely new phenomenon, like the 1992 riots didn't happen or the 1960s and 70s ones. It's just, there's so much less, nowadays, just anything that happens, a fire, an explosion, a terrorist attack, any kind of incident, it's just immediately on Facebook Live and everyone sees it and it's all over the news. And it just, stuff just went under the radar before.
Yeah, it feels more immediate and more prevalent because you see it. And often the way social media works, because people react to that kind of thing, obviously, it's scary, it's sad. People react to it. So then you see more the way that the social media algorithms work. Yeah. So it's being put in your face a lot more than it would have, 50 years ago. You might see 50 years ago, if there's, a terrorist attack on another continent, maybe you see it in the newspaper and that's it. But nowadays that's not at all the case, but there are some benefits to this, even though it has this kind of psychological downside where if you're not actively looking for good news, like listening to this podcast, you tend to see a lot more of the bad news. But the plus side is that when we're more aware of these things, we have more information, we can deal with them better. The case of crime is a really easy one. If we can catch somebody on camera, we can apprehend the criminal and deal with it from there. But going back to drones and sharks, in this case, we know more about shark behavior. We know how it impacts people, which is very little, and we can adjust how we deal with sharks and beaches accordingly. And I'm going to borrow Lowe's bottom line here to finish this off. He says, the bottom line is there's no doubt that drones have given people a different perspective because they get to see the sharks around people and see that the sharks aren't attacking. So benefit in this case.
I think that's wonderful, really.
Yeah.
So to recap quickly, I started us off by talking about the Afghan robotics team's escape from Afghanistan, and then you talked about reducing infant mortality caused by bacterial infections.
Yes, and then in our honorable mentions, you talked about the Tesla bot that Elon Musk has announced. I talked about the really fascinating effort to use elephant trunks, the way they move to inspire better robotics. And then you talked about the graphene-based coating for implants to reduce infections. And I finished off by talking about sharks and drones. Thank you so much for joining us on Innovation Celebration.
Thank you.